What is up, my friends, and how's it going? And welcome to the 5th episode of the Factional Overview series with your fellow comrade Summary. In this episode, we will be going through the second faction that won the YouTube community votes, namely the Arverni. They are a Galii faction, and historically speaking, they were led by Vercingetorix. They were a powerful tribe that united a Gallic confederation against the invading forces of Roman Republic under the famous Julius Caesar. However, he was defeated eventually at the Battle of Alesia, with Caesar building a double-walled encampment, which is still studied in military history today. And of course, he built both of the walls. One is to contain the settlement of Alesia and the defenders, and the outer walls were basically to face the oncoming threat of the Gallic relief force and from preventing them to attack the Romans on both sides of the battle. However, it was a very dire battle. In the end, however, Julius Caesar came up on top and the Arverni were eventually defeated. However, without any further ado, let us hop right into the episode. Keep in mind, we have a 4-part episode in this series from henceforth, as was done with the previous Galatian faction. In the first part, we will be going through the roster in depth for the Arverni. In the second part, we will be covering my recommended army composition for the Arverni, and I am going to include a early composition as well. Was suggested by one of the YouTube community members, because in most of my factional overview series, I basically create a late game army composition that faces off against a typical Roman Marian legion. However, many of you are struggling possibly with the early game opening and kind of trying to identify what units are the most ideal units to get in the early game and slowly phase them out during the middle to late game. However, as far as the Galatians are concerned, I think their population class 3 spears as well as Galatian swordsmen are really good. So for those of you wondering, for the Galatians, those are the two primary units you want to go for. And of course, considering that they don't have any good skirmishers, you could go for javelin skirmishers. In that case, you couldn't go wrong with Gallic skirmishers. And of course, you want to rely heavily upon mercenary units wherever you can, because of that population class disadvantage that you have in the early game, as you are surrounded by a plethora of non-Celtic factions, and of course the surrounding culture of the region that you will conquer will not be Celtic, so you will not have early game access to population. However, with the Arverni, things are very different. They are in the heartland of Gaul, and of course they are surrounded by a lot of Celtic tribes. You're not really liked among the Celtic tribes. You're surrounded by very hostile Celtic tribes, with the exception of course Nemeton, which is held by the Pictones, who are your defensive allies at the start of the game. However, you also begin the game in a war against the Hedui, and of course you have to kind of defeat them, and it's a little bit hard to do so because they do have the walled settlement of Bibracte, which is the provincial capital of the province of Galatia. The only other route of expansion you have in the early game is via the southwestern road, which actually leads up to Brigantium, I believe, yes, which is present-day Bordeaux. I don't think it's Brigantium. Could be. It's Burdigala, yeah, that's what it is. All right, so it's Burdigala, and they are under the control of the Vivici, I believe, which is another Gallic tribe, and of course they are also slightly hostile towards you. So you're surrounded by two walled settlements. You start off with the single settlement of Nemesis, and of course it's going to be a difficult start in the early game. However, without any further ado, let us go ahead and introduce the Arverni as a faction, discuss some of their buffs, debuffs, and so forth. They are of course part of the Galii faction group, which means they get the +1 experience rank for all Gallic cavalry recruits from the Gallic horsemanship. Now, this is not a very powerful buff in my opinion. However, with the Arverni, it is very useful, as you will see in the part 1 of this episode when we go through the the Arverni roster itself. You will understand that the Arverni boast some of, if not the best, cavalry in the entirety of Western Europe, and of course, without a shred of doubt, they have the best cavalry when it comes to all of the Celtic factions. That being said and done, the second buff you have is the Druidic culture, which gives increased population from temples when the culture is dominant. This is really good. It is better, of course, for the Galatians because you're not surrounded by any of your native population. However, as the Arverni, it's not that crucial, but it is a nice buff nonetheless, because more population, especially from temples, which boost your population class 1 and 2, which is your elite and noble class and your warrior class respectively. This is really good considering that these are the two population classes you will need to build more elite armies and more professional armies that can hold up against the might of Rome. So definitely having a lot more population growth in these particular sections of society or in your cultural regions is really important. However, as the Arverni, you have 3 modifiers. 2 are buffs and the last one is the debuff. Going over the buffs, you have Gallic craftsmanship, which gives increased income from metal resource building chains. And now this is quite a powerful buff because as the barbarian faction, you do not really have as robust an economy as some of the more civilized factions, which can build some really good main settlement chain buildings. However, with the barbarians, you kind of lack a little bit in your economy, but the one thing that the barbarians can excel in is, of course, industry as a source of income, and that is because they actually have what I believe is the goldsmith, which comes under the agricultural or the green, building tree. And what this does is basically upgrades all your wealth from industry as well as all sources and so forth. So it's a really good building to have, and it synergizes really well with metal resource building chains, which is pretty much what this buff is giving you. However, of course, in the late game when you're making tons and tons of money and you're pretty much playing with the economy turned off, it's not going to be that influential as a buff for you. However, in the early game, especially since you're surrounded by Gallia, which is a province with a lot of metal resource building chains, this is really, really nice buff to have. And of course, I know most of you who have watched Talksburg, who's a fellow YouTuber who has basically explained my economic guide. Keep in mind the economic guide needs to be kind of updated. It is pretty much, I would say, 90% relevant even today, especially the core, fundamentals of the guide. However, the more nuanced things like which provinces are A tier, S tier, which resources are, A tier, S tier, has changed in the 1.3.4 public beta, as they are currently being modified by Q Sertorius. And the current meta actually has, what I would like to say is the current meta has actually reduced the S tier of certain provinces. So you have a province like Latium and Hellas, which were previously S tier. They are now bumped down to A tier in my opinion. Of course, this is all subjective. And certain provinces like Gallia, which was a B tier province, and of course you had Hispania, which was, I believe, a B or C tier province, have received massive buffs. They are now pretty much an A tier province, and in their own right, each of them in my preliminary testing can generate anywhere between 100 to 150,000 denarii per turn on low taxation. So that's just how powerful they are. But more on that in a future video in which I will be covering the changes of the 1.3.4 public beta. Of course, a lot of work is going into it. Not a lot of factional work, but a lot of balancing and polishing some factions that have been ignored. However, that being said and done, the second buff we have is the superior ones, in which we can form client states. This is quite nice if you're playing as, the base Dividate Impera. However, me personally, I always use the all diplomatic, option submod. And with that submod, which is an official Dividate Impera submod, for those of you wondering, you can check out my Let's Play Seleucid series, in which that submod is linked in the description with all of the other submods that I use with Dividate Impera. However, if you're not playing with that submod, then this is quite decent to have. However, in my opinion, client states are pretty much useless in Dividate Impera and in Rome 2 generally speaking. And that is because they still retain their own sovereign foreign policy, which means that if you subjugate a faction into a client state, they will still retain the wars they are in, and they could still end up being wiped out. It's a lot harder for you to, you know, be their suzerain, so to speak. And if you really want them to survive, then you're going to have to fight their wars. What's even more difficult is that if you have multiple client states and they kind of have bad relationships with each other, they can draw you into a war against your own client state, and you will take a diplomatic hit. So in my opinion, client state is not really a powerful diplomatic option as far as the game is concerned right now. Of course, in the east, you have the eastern factions like the Diadochi, the Parthians, the Mauryaans, and so forth. They have access to creating satrapies as their subjects, and this is by far the most superior version, because in the case of satrapies, you don't really have their sovereign foreign policy, and they just basically follow the foreign policy of the overlord, which means they are a lot more easy to manage. They don't tend to declare war on each other, therefore you're not pulled into a war against one of your own client states, or one of your own subjects rather, by trying to defend your other subjects. So that's just my thoughts on the superior ones. However, as a debuff, you do have internal power struggles, which basically gives you a public order penalty from Celtic culture. Considering you're a Celtic faction, this is quite a significant debuff, especially in the early game. In the late game, you shouldn't really be struggling with public order, as you have more buildings to deal or combat public order issues, as well as you probably have better government reforms and so forth that will help you deal with your public order. However, in the early game, this is significant, and I mean significant because in the early game, of course, you are going to get that public order issues, because you're not going to be able to handle public order as easily in the early game. And especially if you conquer foreign territory, then this debuff is actually a double debuff, because you actually get a public order penalty from foreign culture, and on top of that, you get a public order penalty for Celtic culture, which is your own culture, which you're trying to grow to actually improve your public order. But what you're ending up doing is actually decreasing your public order by conversion. So in the early game, this can be pretty significant, especially if you are conquering foreign territory with different culture, and you're slowly trying to build up your own Celtic culture in the region. However, thankfully speaking, in the early game, you're surrounded by Celtic culture, so you won't really have a lot of foreign culture public order debuffs. However, you will still have to contend with the public order penalties from your own Celtic culture, so it's a lot harder to stabilize your realm as the Arverni in the early game. However, that being said and done, we are done with the introduction for the Arverni, so let's hop on to the next part of the guide, in which we will be covering each and every single unit in the Arverni roster one by one. Alright, welcome to part 1, in which we will be covering the roster for the Arverni. I have gone ahead and arranged my army in the typical formation, with General in Group 1, melee units behind, followed by spear units, frontline units such as the phalanx infantry, we have our missile infantry, melee cavalry, and finally our skirmisher cavalry. And straight off the bat, you can kind of guess that the Galatians do have quite a lot of infantry options. We do have melee infantry, but where the Galatians actually shine is their spear infantry, and of course their cavalry is quite good as well. As you can see, we have a lot of options when it comes to spear infantry. If we include our phalanx options, which are pretty much barbarian shield walls, which is the equivalent of the Hellenic hoplite phalanx, you have about 9 options available for the Arverni. However, that being said and done, before we hop into, of course, the part 1 of this guide, as you can see, we have the new unit cards for the Arverni, courtesy to an Optimate again for his help. And definitely, guys, if you're willing to help me out, I have some videos that will guide you on the process of how to make these unit cards. It will kind of make it a lot easier for me to complete my vision with the unit card overhaul for the entirety of Divided Impera. Of course, for now, we are focusing on the playable factions, but we will also have to deal with the AI factions, which have some pretty outdated unit cards, as most of you who play Divided Impera already know. And of course, after that, we will be focusing on the AOR and mercenary unit cards as well. So it is a pretty massive project, it's a pretty massive undertaking, very ambitious if I can say so myself, and I need as much help as I possibly can. So if you guys volunteer, that would really be great. And in order to volunteer, then you can just hit me up on my Discord. I will send you some of the links to the videos in which I explain how to make make unit cards, and we can take it from there. We can work, we can collaborate, and we can really make Dividend Impera unit cards great again. However, that being said and done, let us hop into the general options we have as the Galatians. The very first unit you have an option is the Gallic Heavy Spearmen. Now, these guys are 300 men in the unit. They actually come from the population class 2, even though they are a general unit, which I find kind of interesting. They do have that defensive formation. As far as stats are concerned, the melee attack and melee defense is pretty standard for a spear unit. It's rather good. Of course, they have an overall weapon damage of 24, which is, 28, 4 of which is armor piercing. And this kind of falls slightly behind my benchmark of 30, but it's very, very rare for a spear unit to have 30 as overall weapon damage, so it's still pretty good for a spear unit to have 28. Anywhere between, I would say 26 to 30 is rather good for a spear unit. As a spear unit, of course, they have a massive bonus versus cavalry and elephants. They have an armor of 20, which isn't all that much. However, if they go into that defensive formation significantly gives a buff to the unit. As you can see, they become into a very tight formation, and you can't really stretch out this formation as opposed to, you know, pike phalanxes or hoplite phalanxes. You're pretty much stuck with the width, as it is not really editable in the game file, so nothing much the Dividend Impera team can do about this. However, what the defensive formation actually gives you is not as much reach as the hoplite phalanx. I won't compare them to pike phalanxes because they are a different category in my opinion. Although they are frontline units, they have a significantly much more reach. These guys have a reach that is comparable to hoplite phalanxes or barbarian shield walls. However, the major difference is they do get a lot more bonuses. They get a bonus versus infantry, which actually adds up to their melee stats, bumping up their melee attack from 8 to 9, melee defense from 20 to 21, and of course the overall weapon damage becomes 29, which inches it closer towards that 30 benchmark. However, they also get a significant bonus towards their, cavalry as well as elephants. It's bumped up from 21 to 25, and more importantly, they get a plus 15 value to their armor, which bumps up their armor to 35, which is really a good armor value, especially for a pop 2 unit. Would I recommend these guys as general? As you guys know, in my previous episode, I would not recommend an infantry unit, especially a slow-moving infantry unit with a speed of 2 as a general on the field of battle, and that is because they can be caught out in a very bad situation, and of course they are not going to be able to reinforce certain troubled areas in the battlefield. You're not going to be able to get there quickly in order to inspire, rally, or apply your buffs as a general to those troops in the front line. So definitely would not recommend these guys as a general unit in the field of battle. However, this is the best option you have for a governor general in a settlement, because of course they are 300 men strong. They do have that powerful defensive formation, which means they can hold chokeholds or choke points in the settlement really well. And as you know, settlements have a lot of streets, and these narrow streets can easily be defended with a unit such as this, or a shield wall unit, or even better, a pike unit. But of course, as the Arverni, you do not have access to Hellenic pikes. That being said and done, let us move on to the next unit. And in the next unit, we have, of course, our, Galatian champion. I'm sorry, I keep saying Galatian. It's Gallic champions. And of course, as you can tell, I am using that dongs for DEI submod created by Semen. And of course, you can see that naked units are actually naked in that kind of, carries on in their unit card as well. But these guys, they're pretty decent unit. They do come from that population class 1. They have a precursor ammunition, and of course they are 200 men strong in the unit. However, where they really shine is their melee attack and their melee stats. They have 17 melee attack, which is rather high, 13 melee defense, which is the median, I would say on the higher end of the melee defenses that you have for a melee unit, and of course an overall weapon damage of 34, 2 of which is armor piercing. They do have a bonus versus infantry, which is kind of nice because that bumps up their overall weapon damage to 35. Of course, that also bumps up their melee attack to 18 and their melee defense to 14 respectively. And they do have a little bit of armor, so they're not going to really be good at holding a front line or anything of that sort. So I wouldn't really recommend them as a governor general as well, because these units are more of a flank flanking unit because, as you can tell, they are fast moving. They do have a lot of melee attack, not so much melee defense. So I would definitely recommend using these units as a flanking unit. As a flanking unit, they're quite good. However, if I were to rate them, I would say they are not the S tier kind of flanking units in my opinion, because unlike most other naked units in the game, especially that are the ones that are available to the Nervii faction, which are comparable in stats to the Gallic Champions, the Gallic Champions do not have the scare ability, so they're not going to be able to, you know, dish out a significant morale penalty on an enemy, even with a very well placed flanking maneuver. However, that being said and done, they are still a very good unit in my opinion. Lastly, you have the Gallic Late Royal Cavalry. Of course, you also have a early variant of the same unit. It is 100 man strong, and it is a pretty powerful Gallic cavalry, and it's one of the best cavalries in the entirety of Western Europe. They have 41 armor, which is rather high, especially considering you know, your counterparts in the Western European hemisphere. And of course, their melee attack is rather low. It's at 12. Their melee defense is a lot higher, and that is to be expected of a spear type cavalry unit. And speaking of a spear type cavalry unit, they do have a bonus versus cavalry and other large you know, cavalry units, but they also have a small bonus versus infantry at 1. Their overall weapon damage is really good. You have 33 weapon damage, which is really powerful considering they are a spear unit, 6 of which is armor piercing, of course. And of course, if you factor in the bonus versus cavalry, then you're probably going to get a total of 37 weapon damage. Maybe 30 will be base weapon damage, and of course 7 might be armor piercing, because the way this bonus works is that it's kind of split in you know, the exact ratio of the weapon damage to armor piercing damage. So as you can see, it's almost a 3-to-1 ratio. Actually, it's a 4-to-1 ratio, so it might be 30 and 7, or it might be 31 and 6, but in my opinion, I think it might be 30 and 7, the way how this will be split. But what's the most important thing about this cavalry is that it has the Maripos horse entry, which is an entity in the game, which is a special horse breed that is assigned to this unit. And the Maripos horse entity, in my opinion, is the second best horse entity in the game. And the way how horse entity works is that it actually increases the mass of your cavalrymen. And the way how mass works is that mass directly impacts how powerful your charges are in the game. So the more mass your cavalry have, the more devastating their charges are going to be. And of course, the best cavalry entity is of course the Nicaean cavalry, but the Marian cavalry are quite close behind. And when you talk about Western Europe, there is hardly any other cavalry with this Maripos entity. But however, for the Celtic factions such as the Nervii as well as the Arverni, you do get access to some of these sweet Maripos entities. However, some of the other entities are Numidian cavalry. Now, Numidian cavalry don't really have mass, but they have a lot of speed, so they are really agile. So they're not really good at devastating charges, they're more good at skirmishing. And finally, you have the Thessalian cavalry, which I believe is the fourth and final entity, and these guys are available to some of the Hellenic factions, especially around the region of Thessaly in you know, in I would say Macedonia as far as the game is concerned, but of course in real geography it's part of Greece. However, with the Thessalian cavalry, you have a bit of both. They are fast moving cavalry and they do have quite a good charge, but however, it's not as devastating as the Maripos and of course the Nicaean cavalry. However, that being said and done, we are going to move on to the next section, in which we are going to talk about the melee infantry. First up, we have the Gallic clubmen. They are pop 3 unit, 300 men in the unit, and they are not so good of a unit. They have a melee attack of 5 and a melee defense of 6, which is rather low for a melee unit. Their overall weapon damage is pretty nice at 29, especially for a pop 3 unit. They have 14 weapon damage, and of course 15 of which is armor piercing value. However, it's not really a good unit. They have no armor. They do have a precursor javelin. They do have you know, that speed of 3, which which means they can be used for flanking, but they're not going to be able to do much on the flank as well, and that is because they have really low melee attack. So I wouldn't really recommend getting this unit, and I would actually try to avoid getting this unit. Next up, you have the Gallic Axemen. Now these guys are a bit better when it comes in comparison to the Gallic Clubmen. They're 200 men in the unit. They come from the population class 2. However, their stats are not that good. And that is because they have a melee attack of 7, a melee defense of 9, which is rather low. They have an armor value of 20, which is comparable to the Agranian Axemen. When I think of single-handed Axemen that have a shield, I almost always like to compare them with the Agranian Axemen, because the Agranian Axemen, in my opinion, some of the best Axemen available in the game. So when you actually look at an Axe unit by comparing their stats side by side with the Agranian Sellswords or the Agranian Axemen, you can get an idea of how good these guys are. Now, in order to compare them with the Agranian Axemen have a melee attack of 11. These guys have a melee attack of 7, which is pretty low. The melee defense for the Agranians is at 12. These guys have 9, so they're not as defensively good as the Agranian Axemen. Of course, their armor is neck to neck with the Agranians. They do come with the precursor javelin like the Agranians. They have the same speed of the Agranians, but their overall weapon damage is rather low. They have 31 weapon damage, which kind of fulfills the benchmark, but for an Axe unit, it's not that good, because when you look at the Agranians, they have a weapon damage of 20 instead of 18, and they have an armor piercing damage of 15 instead of 13. However, they do get the bonus versus infantry. They also get a bonus versus elephants, as most Axe units do, but pretty much for the most part of the early game, you won't be facing off against any elephants, because the only elephant faction that is near to your location are the Numidians and of course the Carthaginians, and they're pretty far off. You are pretty much surrounded by Gallic factions, and then you have Britannic factions to your north, Germanic factions to your east. Of course, you have the Romans to your southeast, and of course to your southwest you have the Iberian factions, none of whom have elephant units, so these guys are not going to be really useful. However, in the early game they're pretty decent, especially as a flanking unit. They're not really amazing. I wouldn't really rely upon these guys as a flanking unit, because just as I explained, their stats aren't all that great. However, next up you have the early Gallic Oathsworn. Now these guys are 200 men in the unit. They do come from that population class 1. They are quite comparable to your Galatian chosen swordsmen. However, they are not as good. While they do have the melee attack of 13 and a melee defense of 11, their overall weapon damage is 32, of which is armor piercing. In comparison, the Galatian chosen swordsmen have an overall weapon damage of 32, of which 30 is the base weapon damage and 2 is the armor piercing. Of course, they do get a +1 bonus versus infantry. They have 30 armor, which again is slightly inferior to the Galatian chosen swordsman. They do have a slow speed of 2, so these guys, they're a decent unit, decent swords unit, but not some of the best sword units in game, especially when considering other Celtic factions that are in the game. Next up, we have the Gallic Champions. I already covered these guys, 200 men in the unit. They do come from that population class 1, and of course, they are similar to that general unit we discussed earlier, so I'm not going to go through them again. However, finally, we have the late Gallic chosen Oathsworn, which are basically an upgrade of the early Gallic Oathsworn. As a Celtic barbarian faction, you get access to the NATO's reforms, which you unlock at turn 90, so long as you have Imperium level 4. Now these guys are pretty decent swordsmen. They have 38 armor, which is the second highest armor value for an infantry unit. Melee attack of 15, defense of 12, which is really good. The overall weapon damage, as you can see, has been bumped up to 32. 1 bonus versus infantry, which is quite nice, and they also come with a precursor javelin, which is quite nice. They do also have that defensive formation, which actually is really nice, because that kind of bumps up their total armor value to 53, as you can see, which is really high armor value. And but would I rate these guys really good? Once again, in comparison to, of course, the Galatian Thorax Swordsmen, which are an upgrade or a direct equivalent to the late Gallic Oathsworn. The only difference is the Galatian version has 41 armor, which is the best armor value in the game. With the late Gallic Oathsworn, they do not have that rating. However, pretty good unit, and if I were to kind of discuss what are the units worth getting among the melee units for the Arverni, I would say the late Gallic Oathsworn are pretty good, and of course the Gallic Champions. Pretty much the rest I wouldn't really recommend them. However, you can use them in the early game if you are looking for some melee infantry options. However, I wouldn't recommend that, personally speaking. Next up, we have our spear units, and we're starting to enter the category in which the Arverni actually excel in. Of course, you have the Gallic Light Spearmen, pretty decent stats, 300 men in the unit coming from that population class 3, overall weapon damage of 26, quite nice for a pop 3 unit, 4 of which is armor piercing. They do have an armor of 8, speed of 3, so even though these guys are frontline units, they're pretty fast moving units, so you can kind of try to kite the enemy into better positions where you are going to be able to surround them and outflank them, but apart from that, nothing much else to discuss about these light spearmen. So let us move on to the next unit, and you have the Galatian naked spearmen. These guys are quite similar to your Galatian naked warriors. They have, you know, the shock spear entry, which gives them a higher melee attack at the cost of some melee defense. Very good overall weapon damage of 31, 6 of which is armor piercing. The bonuses versus cavalry and elephants, of course, they have 3 ammunition, which isn't as much as, of course, the Galatian naked warriors that have 4 ammunition. So they're quite similar, but they're not as good, once again, as the Galatian naked warriors. Do you want to get these guys? I mean, that's totally up to you. If you want to support your cavalry, as you saw with the video with the Galatians, I really used these guys to support my missile cavalry because I was really playing asymmetrically on the flanks. As the Galatians, you don't really have a very good cavalry, so you kind of have to play that out very asymmetrically. You're gonna have to try to you know, lure the enemy cavalry into a disfavorable situation, and then you can use your naked spearmen to combat against that cavalry because they're fast moving and they will be able to support your own cavalry. But in the case of the Arverni, these guys are not all that useful. Next up, we have the Galatian veteran freemen. Now these guys are from that population class 3. They do have an armor value of 15, slightly better melee stats, overall weapon damage of 28, which is really good. And as a pop 3 unit, these guys are really good. So in my opinion, these guys are much better than your Gallic light spearmen. So in the early game, if you can afford to do so, I would definitely recommend getting the veteran freemen. And of course, they also have a precursor javelin, which is quite nice for a unit with 300 men, because 300 javelins thrown at once can dish out some serious preliminary damage to the enemy that you're going to face off against. And then of course, they are quite defensible, so these guys are pretty respectable frontline unit in the early game. I would definitely recommend them if you have the funds in order to maintain the upkeep cost for these guys, because these guys are significantly more expensive than, of course, your Gallic light spearmen. Lastly, you have the Gallic Heavy Spearmen. These guys are the exact same as your general, you know, version. Of course, they do come from that population class 2. They have 300 men in the unit, and as such, they are a pretty good unit. And of course, with that defensive formation, they are a pretty good frontline unit. And you can get these guys quite earlier on in the campaign, but however, 300 men coming from that population class 2 is going to be a little bit hard to achieve, especially in the early game. So wouldn't really focus on these guys in the early game. However, in the mid to late game, when you get access to more population class 2, then definitely hire these guys. These are some of the most important units you can get as the Arverni. Next up, we have the Phalanx units available to the Arverni. Not much to discuss over here. These guys are pretty good, pretty standard considering their respective population classes. Of course, we start off with the early Gallic Shield Wall Spearmen. These guys are a pop 2 unit, 200 men in the unit, 20 armor, which is pretty decent. And of course, they do have that shield wall formation, which allows them to kind of form up into a Hellenic type phalanx, and as you can see, they do have a bit of a reach. So these guys are really good against lightly armored units that do not have a formation attack, that are all about that attack. These guys will be able to kind of hold quite well against them. So these are a good option for frontline units. It's really a toss-up between, of course, your shield wall spearmen and, of course, your heavy spearmen. Next up, we have the late Gallic Shield Wall Spearmen, which are basically the Nitos upgrade versions of your early Gallic Shield Wall Spearmen. Overall weapon damage of 28, pretty good. Melee armor piercing is 4. They do have a slight improvement to their armor values as far as melee stats are concerned. No real significant improvement in my opinion, apart from, of course, their armor value. And although you do see some chainmail in here, their armor value is only 25, which is not that good. These guys will get absolutely annihilated by missile units, especially javelin units. Would I recommend them as a frontline unit? I guess so. I mean, in my opinion, I'm really torn apart the frontline options that the Arverni have. Because they do also have the Gallic Heavy Spearman, which is a really good unit because it has that defensive formation. It's not as good as the Shield Wall formation, but of course they do have 300 men in the unit. They will get a lot more armor. Their armor gets bumped up from 20 to 35, which is almost, almost 30% more than the armor value of your late Gallic Shield Wall Spearman. Next up, you have the early Gallic Noble Shield Wall. Now these guys are pretty good. 35 armor. They do come from the population class 1. They're 200 men in the unit. Decent melee stats. Overall weapon damage of 28, 4 of which is armor piercing. But of course that armor is what makes them good. And these guys are quite a good frontline unit, but they do come from that population class 1, so they might not be easy to build an army entirely composed of these guys. And of course the next unit we have, a really good looking unit in my opinion, is the late variant of this early Gallic Noble Shield Wall. And of course with the late variant you have even better armor and even better stats and an overall weapon damage of 30, 4 of which is armor piercing. So these guys are really good in my opinion. They can form a very good and solid and sturdy front line. However, of course, they do come from that population class 1. They are a noble unit, and as such they're going to be really hard to recruit. And it's a lot easier in my opinion to recruit noble cavalry versus noble infantry, because cavalry are 100 men strong typically. They might be 120 men depending on the faction you're playing. If you're playing an eastern faction or a nomadic faction, then you will have 120 men in your cavalry unit. However, if you're playing as a European faction or a Western faction, so to speak, then you will only have 100 men in the unit. What it means is that for 4 units of cavalry in an army of 20 units, you will have to pay a total of 400 pop 1, or you might even have to pay 480 pop 1 depending on the size of the cavalry unit. However, if you get 4 infantry units, you have to pay 800, which is double that. So it's, if you can sustain the population, then these guys are definitely worth it. But if you cannot, then it's a bit of a Spartan kind of a situation where some of the only good units such as the Spartan phalanxes come from your first class population. So definitely a really solid unit, but not that easy to maintain. And as far as the barbarian factions are concerned, these are some of the best shield wall units that are in the game. Of course, the faction that has better shield wall units than this are the Scordisii, and that is because they actually use the short pike entry that is available to some of the Peltaste pikemen of the Macedonians, as well as the Ptolemids, I believe, have access to Peltaste pikemen, which are a short pike variant of the Phalangitae, and they're a bit more offensive than defensively oriented, which means those guys can be used really to devastating effect on flanking maneuvers. However, these guys are more of a frontline unit. That being said, let us move on to the next section, in which we are going to be talking about the missile infantry available to the Arverni. We have 4 options available, starting with the Gallic archers. Similar to your Galatian counterparts, they are not that good, so I wouldn't really recommend them. What they do have is a decent amount of armor piercing, and but that's not going to do much considering they have really poor melee stats. Melee attack of 5, defense of 12, armor of 1, so these guys are not going to be that great. Of course, after that you have your Gallic skirmishers. These guys, once again, not that great because they are a typical skirmishing unit. Don't get me wrong, skirmishers are quite useful, and of course so are archers, but the way I try to analyze archers, of course, or skirmishers, is of course their stats as a skirmisher unit, but more importantly also their versatility. The more versatile they are, the better, because once you're done depleting your ammunition, these are units that will pretty much participate in the battle if they do have melee capability, or they're gonna have to sit out for the rest of the battle if they do not have a good melee capability. Another thing I look out for in a skirmisher type unit is their ability to counter cavalry, and that is because that allows me to be a little bit more bold with how I use my missile units. If they do have a spear and they can counter cavalry, then I like to play them in a little bit more advanced positions on the battlefield, kind of try to entice the cavalry to charge into them. Of course, no missile unit is going to be able to counter cavalry, but what they can do is that they can hold their own against cavalry until help arrives, and in the meantime they can even deal some significant damage to the cavalry that's attacking them. And while you might think that you will lose a lot of missile units, in my opinion cavalry units are more important than missile units, so trading off some of your missile units to get rid of some of the enemy cavalry units, in my opinion, is a really good trade-off. So whenever you guys can do that, then that's a good thing to do. However, in the case of the Gallic skirmishers and the Gallic archers, these guys are not going to be able to hold their own against enemy cavalry. If they do get charged down, they're going to break and instantly flee from the battle. Next up we have the Gallic heavy skirmishers. These guys are 175 men strong. They come from that population class too, which makes them a little bit harder to access. However, as a skirmisher unit, they are quite versatile. As you can see, they have a melee attack of 11, melee defense of 9, pretty standard missile capabilities and ammunition of 6, shots per minute at 6, of course the missile damage at 21, which is rather on the median for skirmisher units, and they do have a decent weapon damage of 28, 2 of which is armor piercing, and they have a little bit of armor at 10, and of course that speed of 4. So these guys are good as a flanking unit. And just look at that officer, he's looking absolutely glorious. Just loving that helmet, really beautiful Montefortino type helmet. However, yes, with the Gallic heavy skirmishers, pretty good unit. They are better melee skirmisher units, so these guys quite good. In my opinion, they are above average, but they are nothing like phenomenal in my opinion. They are above average in their melee stats, but as opposed to some of their counterparts, their melee stats are not that good. But then again, as opposed to some of their counterparts, they do have a bit more ammunition, so they are kind of like a versatile skirmisher unit, but leaning a bit more into the skirmishing side of things rather than the melee side of things. So definitely a nice unit, but nothing too groundbreaking. Next up we have the Gallic Slinger Spearmen. Now these guys, they're pretty good. They have pretty average Slinger stats, 11 missile damage, which is standard for Slinger units, range of 119, which is again standard for a Slinger unit. They do have an armor of 8, which is quite nice, means they're a little bit more capable of taking some punishment from enemy missile units. They do have a shield, which is once again really good against enemy missile units, because the shield will protect you against incoming projectiles. Meanwhile, if the enemy does not have shields, you will be dealing full damage to them. Of course, not factoring in the accuracy of your projectiles, considering that all of your projectiles land and all of their projectiles land, you're going to be able to do a lot more damage because you have some armor as well as you have a shield, which significantly helps against missile units more than even armor. Shields play a vital role, because the way how it works is that when a projectile lands on a unit, it does a series of calculations. First calculation it does is, does it land on the target? For that it has 2 calculations, or 3 calculations rather. The first calculation is accuracy. So was it accurate enough to land on, let's say, this person? Yes, it was. Now the second calculation was, does this guy manage to dodge the projectile? no, let's say he didn't manage to dodge it. And then finally, the third thing it decides was this guy able to block it with his shield? No, he wasn't able to block it with his shield. And then it factors in the damage of, minus the armor of how much HP it takes out from this unit. However, of course, if he doesn't have shield and, his dodge is kind of low, so the shield value actually increases your missile block chance. And unfortunately, you can't really see that in the game. All you can see is the shield value itself. You can't really see the missile block chance. However, if you go to the Divided Impera website, you can see the block chance, and some of the higher block chances are anywhere between 75 to 80%. And of course, the Roman Testudo formation has a whopping 90 to 95% missile block chance. Pretty much blocks out 90% of enemy missiles, but any shield is very useful in a missile to missile skirmishing kind of a face-off. So these guys quite good. Apart from that, they do have a spear with decent weapon damage of 26.4, which is armor piercing. Keep in mind, these guys are not even a spear unit, and they have a really good weapon damage as a slinger unit. But more importantly, as a spear unit, they do get a bonus versus cavalry. So let's say a cavalry unit is trying to charge at you. You want to stay your ground so that you have that bracing ability. Of course, these guys are not going to have that significant amount of bracing. That is because, of course, they are loosely spaced. But you want to be as still as you possibly can. You probably want to turn off your fire at will so they are even better embraced. And then when the cavalry charges, they're not going to be able to knock these guys down. And, these guys might take an initial bit of casualties from that charge, but eventually they're going to be able to stabilize the situation and dish out some punishment of their own, because they have spear units or spear weapons that are very good against cavalry. And so I do consider these units to be pretty good, and I do believe they come from that population class 3. If not, they come from population class 2, but either which ways, they're pretty good a slinger unit to have. Not the best slingers out there, but a very interesting unit, especially since they have that spear. It means you can position them in front of your front lines, and you can allow these guys to soak up some of the enemy missiles, thereby protecting your own front lines. Because typically, as most of you have seen my videos, especially my Let's Play series, I put up my melee troops ahead of my missiles to protect my missiles, not from enemy missiles. I don't really care about enemy missiles all that much. What I do care about is if the enemy cavalry decides to charge me. So if the enemy cavalry decides to charge a skirmisher unit, then I kind of have to run behind my front lines, and sometimes that can be a messy situation. They might not be able to get across, and even once they get across, then the front line has to form up into that formation in order to brace for the enemy charge. And as you can tell, it takes some time to get into that position, so it's pretty messy. However, when you do have a spear unit like this, they don't really need to run behind. They can pretty much stay there and kind of eat that cavalry charge until, of course, you can slowly advance your spearmen, and these spearmen, of course, will quickly dispatch off the cavalry in question. However, lastly, we have our cavalry, and in the cavalry, of course, we have our melee cavalry and we have our missile cavalry. Speaking of missile cavalry, first we have 120 men in the unit, the Gallic light cavalry, armor of 11. These guys come from that population class 2. The ammunition of 6, the melee attack and melee defense is not that great. They are anti-cavalry focused, unlike the Galatian light skirmishers, which have, a lot of armor piercing value. These guys don't, so they are going to be using a spear entry by the looks of it, with 26 base damage and 5 armor piercing damage, which is pretty decent. But once again, these guys are not that good as the Galatian counterparts. However, they can fulfill a very critical role in the battlefield, and that is kind of trying to lure the enemy into an unfavorable fight, especially missile units if you can do so, and of course the cavalry units if you can do so. Finally, we are going to be talking about the melee cavalry available to the Arverni. You have two options. You have the Gallic early medium cavalry and you have the Gallic late heavy cavalry. Of course, the late cavalry is a upgrade of the early medium cavalry. which is unlocked during the NATO's reforms. And now the important thing of them both is that they have pretty decent stats, and most importantly they also have the Maripos entry, and also most importantly they come from that population class 2, which means with most factions, some of your more elite cavalry, especially cavalry with such amazing stats like the Arverni Ridgeporedoi, I'm not gonna really attempt to pronounce that again, but especially as the late heavy cavalry, coming in from that population class 2 is really good. What this means is that you can focus on getting some more population class 1 units as infantry units or as spear units, because as your cavalry options, you don't really have a pop 1 cavalry. So for the most part, you are not going to be using pop 1 at all unless you use them for your melee infantry, such as your spearmen or your pure melee infantry or even your phalanx type infantry. So that's what makes the Galatian cavalry quite powerful. Of course, the Maripos entry means they pack a mean punch on the charge and can dish out some pretty serious damage on the charge. So these guys are really good. In the entirety of the Western Hemisphere, you will not find cavalry that's better than this cavalry. Of course, the Nervii have an equivalent to this cavalry, but the Nervii have better melee infantry, and what they do sacrifice for that in return is, of course, this cavalry that the Nervii have, the equivalent of which is called the Reme Maripos cavalry, actually comes from the first class population, so they're a lot harder to replenish. However, the Arverni variant is a lot easier to replenish, and you can pretty much even spam these guys. You can have 6 of these units in the game, or as I'd like to have a total of 4, including of course my general cavalry, and I like to get 2 of the Gallic light cavalry because ever since I did the Galatian guide, I'm pretty much in love with the ability of light cavalry to kind of entice the enemy to fight in unfavorable situation, kind of try to neutralize the enemy's support, and then kind of allow my front lines to clash. And I find out that this actually makes battles a lot more efficient, and of course it also means that you're able to preserve a lot of your frontline units. What it means is that of course your support units are possibly going to get tired, they're going to be taking a lot more casualties, they're going to be taking a brunt of the fighting. However, what that also means is that it is an advantage for the Arverni because these guys are pop 2, so you don't really mind if you lose a bit more cavalry than what is required. However, that being said and done, before we hop on to the next part in which I talk about the army composition, let me actually explain what I mean when I say support troops and main troops. What I actually mean by support troops are anything behind this line, really. So we're talking about our missile units and we're talking about our cavalry. Now these guys are typically placed on the flank or behind what is known as your frontline units. So your frontline units are obviously going to be your spearmen and of course your swordsmen, and I would even consider swordsmen to be a bit of both. So they can be frontline units, but they can also be support units, especially flanking type swordsmen like the Gallic champions. However, that being said and done, we're done with this part of the guide, so let us hop into the second part of the guide where I will be discussing my preferred army composition for the Arverni, and of course also giving a few pointers for the early game army composition for the Arverni. But as you can tell, with the Arverni, you're not really lacking in a lot of departments. You are pretty significantly good in most of the departments. Of course, the only department you're lacking in is your missile infantry, and to a certain degree you are limited with your choice as far as melee infantry is concerned. So some of the good units that I would recommend as melee infantry probably would be some of the Scutari mercenaries that are available in Iberia. These guys are quite good. Of course, you do have some pretty decent mercenary options available in Germania, especially the Berserker. The naked Berserker warriors that are quite good because they have that scare ability. Of course, they're going to come from that foreign population class, and they're also going to have a lot of armor piercing because they use axes. So those guys are going to be a lot better than your Gallic champions as well in order to use, because you don't really care about them taking casualties. Even though they're naked and they most probably will be taking a lot of casualties, you will pretty much be able to preserve your first class population and probably focus on your first class population in other areas such as your frontline troops. However, when it comes to your missile infantry, of course, while you do have a good Gallic Slinger Spearmen, which is quite good because as a support unit you can position them in front of your front lines. You do have some good options around you, such as the Balearic Slinger mercenary unit that is available in Iberia, and of course if you manage to go all the way down south into, let's say, Sicily or even the Hellenic world, then you can get access to, of course, Cretan archers as well as the Sicilian crossbowmen. However, that being said and done, let us hop on to the next part and I will see you guys there. Alright guys, welcome to part 2 of the guide, and in this part we will be discussing my personal army compositions for the Arverni. Of course, if I were to create very quickly over here an early game army for the Arverni, what I would focus on is getting as many of these, Gallic Light Spearmen in the early game. Nothing much else we can do. The early game composition is not that important in my opinion. Of course, you could get some slingers as well. Slingers are quite good. And lastly, you want to fill out the remaining of your army with about 6 of these guys, skirmisher cavalry. And since you don't really have a good melee, flanking units, you can perhaps go for 2 of these. They're not going to be that amazing, the Gallic Axemen. But you could also go for the Gallic Clubmen. The Gallic Clubmen is not that good, so you could possibly just complete it all up with Gallic Light Spearmen, of course. And if you're lucky and you tend to notice that the campaign AI is getting a lot of lightly armored units, then you can replace maybe a couple of these guys and get some javelins, because javelins are really good against lightly armored opposition. And yeah, as such, this would be my early game composition, but of course this composition is not going to be able to take on a well protected Roman Marian legion. So when it comes to the Roman Marian legion, of course we're going to go for the late Gallic Royal Cavalry, and we are going to go ahead and get 4 of these guys, because they're quite good and they can basically act as a screen in front of our front line. As far as our flanking units are concerned, we don't have a lot of options, but before we do that, let's get our cavalry. We're going to get 3 of the late Gallic heavy cavalry, one of which we will pair up with our general, and the other 2 will form a different flank. And of course we're going to get 2 of these Gallic light cavalry as well, in order to lure some of the Roman army into our trap. And of course, apart from that, we have 10 more remaining slots, and as of now you can tell we have pretty much just recruited, with the exception of our general, of course, only population class 2 units, which means we will have access to population class 1 unit that we can use. And for that I will go ahead and get 4 of these Gallic champions, which is 800, and it is pretty steep to pay 800 population class 1 for a single army. But since you're not really spending population class 1 on pretty much anything else, then I would recommend this. And in terms of your front line, you could go for, population class 2 late Gallic Shield Wall Spearmen. But in my opinion, of course, the heavy spearmen are going to be significantly better because they have the defensive formation, which will bump up their armor from 20 to 35. And of course, they have better ability to absorb missile damage, so that's really going to be important. What I would recommend eventually, when you're able to, let's say, replace some of your melee units like your Gallic champions with perhaps, let's say, some of the Germanic mercenaries that are better, as I explained in the previous section, then you can replace these Gallic heavy spearmen with some Gallic noble shield wall, as these guys are definitely the best frontline option that you have. So if I were to rate frontline options, I would say the population class 2 shield wall is 3rd place, followed by the Gallic heavy spearmen, which is 2nd place, and then of course your noble shield wall, both late and early, are 1st place. So eventually you can replace it, but for the sake of this battle I am going to be fighting with a slightly inferior Gallic heavy spearmen, and of course the remaining of which is going to be filled up with our Gallic champions. That being said and done, let us hop on to part 3, where we test out this composition against the Roman legion. Alright guys, welcome to the battle. We have our army composition that we are going to face off against the Romans. So let's quickly arrange our armies. We're going to select our cavalry first, as I like to keep cavalry on the first 4 numbers so that they are much easier to access. Then we're going to select our spear slingers, position them in the front of our lines. We're going to select our flanks, followed by our front line, followed by the other flank. Quickly select them, position them slightly behind our spear slingers. And then what we're going to do is double click all of the Gallic heavy spearmen, toss in that defensive formation. As you can see, they are not close to each other, so we're going to try to maximize their width a little bit more. And there you have it. That is slightly perfect. Actually, we want to reduce it a bit more, slightly increase it and reposition them, so that's perfect. Undo the defensive formation so that they are in their new positions. Go ahead, click that. Just a quick test, see the defensive formation kind of works. Gonna double click all of our Gallic champions. With the control and down arrow keys, we are going to be reducing their width and moving them slightly behind and slightly outwards, so that they find it a lot easier to support our frontline units and flank into our frontline units. Now, the way I'm going to perform this flank is that, in order to save time, what most people do when they have 2 units like this on their flank is that they flank with this unit and then they flank with this unit in that fashion, and that actually takes a long time to perform. Actually, this one takes an extremely short time to perform, and this one takes a very long time to go all the way around and hit the enemy. Instead, what I have discovered is that there is a much faster way to do it. What you want to do is run this unit up straight, across and down, so that, as you can see, it's slightly longer than its first option. But what it does is that it reduces this guy's movement by quite a significant amount. So while this guy goes straight up ahead, this guy is going to go up and then directly to the side. This guy is going to go up, side and down. So there we go. That's going to make it a lot faster to flank the enemy units. Now that we have all our infantry in position, we are going to begin positioning our cavalry. They're going to be a little bit advanced, and of course we are going to go for our similar strategy that we had with the Galatians. We're going to reduce their width, kind of space out our cavalry a little bit so that we can micromanage them a bit better. And last but not the least, we want to make sure we select our front line and our slingers, toggle on that guard mode so that they stay in formation even if the enemy tries to retreat. We're not going to toggle on guard mode for, of course, our flanking infantry, because once our flanking infantry actually performs a successful flank, if the enemy routs, we want our flanking infantry to give a little bit of a chase so that we can inflict some more casualties and even break a shattered army. However, that being said and done, let's go ahead and start the game. We're going to quickly move up our cavalry, holding down that control key so that they move up a bit slow. Meanwhile, we are slowly but surely going to progress our entire front line into position. Take a quick look at the enemy Roman legion. They have some heavy skirmishers. Now, these guys have shields and 20 armor, so they're pretty good at taking missile damage. Meanwhile, these archers, the Roman Italic auxiliary archers, have about 38 armor, which means they're really, really heavily armored. However, they're going to be at a significant disadvantage compared to our slingers, because our slingers have shields, and shields are really good at mitigating missile damage. Meanwhile, these guys don't have shields, so they're going to be taking the full brunt force of our slings, and slings are actually quite good against armor because they have higher armor piercing value of 6 versus their base damage of 5. Behind, of course, the Roman missile troops, we have the spear auxilia, and behind them we have our Roman cohorts. On either flank, as you can see, we have 2 cavalry cohorts on the left, and we have a single cavalry cohort on the right, and the generals all the way in the center back of their formation. So now that we have discussed the Roman armies, we are going to try to move our cavalry at a much faster pace towards the enemy. We're going to double click on a light missile cavalry, make sure to toggle on that skirmish mode, and the idea over here is to entice this cavalry to come out, and we're going to try to dispatch these cavalry and get a cavalry advantage over the enemy. So the idea of this first phase of the battle, and I like these kind of battle phases that I have started to adopt in my battles ever since playing the Galatians, is that you want, of course, to fight your battles in 2 phases. You want to get rid of the enemy support troops, and then when you are fighting frontline versus frontline, you are going to be able to dish out a lot of damage and get rid of their front line relatively quickly, because they will have no support. Meanwhile, your own troops will have a lot of support. So right now that's pretty much what we're doing. We're trying to move it around. Just quick hold down that space key and you can see that our slingers are somewhere over here. Their range is over here. I want their range to be a little bit closer, so we're gonna have to kind of move up ahead. All the while you're doing this, keep in mind that you're gonna have a lot of micromanagement to deal with. So a way to kind of see what's going on is actually keep a close eye on what's going on in your minimap, so that if you're accidentally focused over here, you don't get charged on this side. If you see some movement happening over here and the enemy, you quickly want to pan behind and you know, basically kind of try to deal with the situation using that manual control. However, over here I do a bit of misclick. While I'm trying to readjust my army, I'm still having a look of what's going on over here. It seems for the most part that the enemy is content staying very, very defensive, of course. So we are going to be a little bit more offensive over here, holding down that space key just to keep an eye of all of my ranges. My slingers are still slightly out of range, and that's okay because I am still going to be trying to entice the enemy to get into this engagement. And since they are, I'm going to advance my melee cavalry. Quick look at my minimap to see nothing's happening on that right flank. Of course, you have some of the archers that are supporting their units over there. So that is exactly the moment in which we want to quickly move up our army a little bit more ahead, so that we can get in range of these archers, kind of take them out of the combat and try to get some really nice shots off on them. Of course, if the archers are going to keep continuing to give chase, then that will give us an advantage. We're going to select our entire melee infantry, and that's why I like to position melee infantry all the way over here, because it kind of gives me a slight advantage in you know, micromanaging all of my units. So very quickly we're going to do that again, keep moving up ahead. We want them to run into position as quickly as possible. What really is the problem is this archer unit over here. It's going to be doing some damage. We're not going to be able to return any of that damage unless we get within range of that archer unit. So what I am going to do over here is quickly try to you know, engage that archer unit. We're going to move our cavalry up really close, try to entice the enemy to deal with us, to kind of you know, engage us. I really want their cavalry to get involved in the fighting, and of course our slingers have begun you know, dealing with the enemy archers, and of course that's going to really significantly impact them. We're going to move our cavalry in a bit more of an advanced position now, try to get some things out of the way. And of course, when you see a melee infantry like this moving towards your cavalry, you wanna absolutely retreat, because you don't want them to hurl their precursor javelins at you. What you want to do is you want to entice their cavalry to make a move for you. So that's pretty much what we're doing. We're trying to release some of that cavalry, trying to you know, entice them to attack. And as of now, they're doing a really good job of being very patient, very defensive. So of course this early initial skirmish phase is going to take a little bit of a while, but as you can see, the archers have already started to take some casualties, not too much. So we are going to try to move up ahead quickly. Just have a look over here, keep moving up these slingers as well. Try to hit against that unit. We're going to try to hit against these units. So okay, these guys are moving behind, so it's might as well just pull back. Meanwhile, attack over here. Quick look to see, okay, this cavalry, I really want to get it out of position so that we can eventually attack. But for now, I'm content with, you know, trying to deal with their slingers. Meanwhile, moving up my cavalry behind, I don't really care because we're not taking a lot of casualties. This archer is kind of pretty much wasting all of its ammunition. Meanwhile, our slingers, wondering if they're actually, you know, affecting anything over here. I'm gonna push back this cavalry a little bit, and hopefully these guys will give chase. Okay, they've started to take some casualties, so that is good news. Meanwhile, these archers, I wonder if they're still firing. They seem to be. And the problem is they're all the way in the back, so they are going to be a little bit of a problem. Meanwhile, over here, as you can see, this archer unit has already taken quite a bit of casualties thanks to our slinger units. As soon as they kind of try to engage us, we can go ahead. It's usually better to be in a little bit of a wider formation so that they cannot you know, deal as much damage to your slingers. And as you can see, our slingers have not taken any damage as of yet, which is great. So we're going to just quickly move our skirmishers over here, try to get a volley off on these guys, kind of try to, you know, get some of that. And I'm pretty comfortable with how slow this battle is going, because for the most part I really want to you know, make sure that I don't end up... Okay, there we go. So these guys are slowly getting routed out, which is good. And very soon they will be completely routed out of the field of battle. We're going to make sure that you know, they kind of stay that way, and we're going to keep firing them until they completely shatter. So that's the objective over here. Meanwhile, we have these two slingers. We're going to push them up forward because we can get within range of these archer units, and it's a little bit annoying what's happening with that archer unit. We're hoping to get close enough to it, and there we have it. We're going to keep attacking it. Meanwhile, I see this cavalry is exposed over here. Of course, as you can tell, this is really a lot of micromanagement, so you got to pay close attention to what's going on either flank. Make sure you don't get caught out of position. You don't want to get caught with your pants down in an unideal situation. We're going to keep moving our slingers behind. Meanwhile, take a quick look at this archer unit. It is starting to take a bit of damage. However, our own light skirmisher units are taking a bit of damage as well. Meanwhile, we're moving our cavalry. We can go ahead and start chasing down this unit so that it doesn't return to the battle. We're going to come a little bit closer, keep a close eye out on our mini-map always, and we are going to just chase with our lighter cavalry because they're going to be a lot quicker, of course. And we can see that this cavalry is trying to commit, and it's probably attracted to the prospect that my general is, you know, close by. So what we're going to do is we're actually going to move our general in a very long path that will kind of cross against our own other cavalry. So we've dealt with that archer unit, so it's completely out of the game for good. Meanwhile, the other archer unit has taken some significant damage, so we are going to keep putting on that pressure on that archer unit over here. That archer unit is occupied, so it means my cavalry over here can be a little bit more aggressive, so that's good news. Meanwhile, okay, we are firing relentlessly into that archer unit. We're trying to get that archer unit out of the equation, so if we get rid of the enemy cavalry and at least two archer units, then it'll be a good position to start attacking the enemy. And over here you can see some of the enemy cavalry is moved all the way in the back. That archer unit is starting to kind of get routed off, so that's pretty good. Meanwhile, what we're going to do, quickly move back, quickly move this ahead, because we don't want to be in a situation where we're caught with this cavalry charge against our slingers. We're going to move our slingers completely behind. There we go. And quickly try to get them into position. That's great. Double tap, get it a little bit ahead, and once they do get into that position, we are going to line up and form into that defensive formation. So right now we're in a very good position. They have you know, kind of dedicated some of their cavalry to attacking over here, and they're not going to do too well against these guys. But what we are going to do is we're going to ensure a follow-up that happens over here, so that you know, we don't end up missing out on the initiative. We're gonna assign our slingers to start hitting this cavalry unit as much as we can. There we go, there we have it. So we're getting some shots off over there. We're going to start moving our cavalry a little bit closer, trying to get a little bit of support going on over there. And now that we have kind of dealt with the enemy archers, we don't really need that much range, so our slingers can be behind, you know, in a little bit of a much better protected position. And there we have it. We're going to start moving our slingers up ahead. Make sure to keep moving our swordsmen also up ahead, so they're still relevant. I'm seeing this cavalry is making a move for me. Meanwhile, over here, this other cavalry is making a move. Keep a close eye on what's happening over there. We are going to charge eventually. And once again, they have gotten extremely defensive. So you can see that this phase will take a little bit of you know, time. Unfortunately, it is going to be a long phase. It's going to take quite a lot of time to get the enemy to kind of commit to the situation. So but pretty much that's what we want to do. We want them to commit entirely, and just keeping a look on that mini-map. Meanwhile, our slingers over here, we have some medium missile archers. Okay, we're gonna keep moving behind very quickly. I really want to find those archers Sagittarium. that's what it is. So we're gonna go ahead, attack those archers. Managed to get a charge off over here, and this unit's losing quite decisively. Meanwhile, one of our skirmisher cavalry has lost all of its munitions, so we might as well charge into the battle. This guy is trying to retreat. Let's pull back our heavy cavalry, allow our light cavalry to give chase. Light cavalry is going to be significantly better at chasing enemy cavalry, so that's pretty much what we're going to do, and it's about perfect timing. So we're going to actually counter charge over here because these guys are looking to charge into our own units. Quickly take a look at the mini map to make sure nothing exactly is happening. Of course, we've gotten the other cavalry as well that is kind of attacked. They seem to be taking some significant losses, even though they managed to get the charge, which is rather unfortunate. So we're gonna pull them back. That's actually super surprising as to how they've taken some losses. I'm guessing it's the javelins of those units over there. So we're gonna quickly pull them out. Pull out. That was not a very favorable situation when that other cavalry kind of charged, and now they're attacking my Jav Cav as well. So we are going to try to support with our general, and I think it's time to actually move up my entire front line, try to pin down the enemy units. So we are going to go ahead and do that very quickly and in quick succession. Go ahead, hit over here. So our general has gotten there. Going to move out. And we've almost gotten rid of another unit of their cavalry unit. They have 2 cavalry units. Unfortunately, some of the skirmishing phase, especially on the left flank, didn't go as good as expected. So that is rather unfortunate. Meanwhile, the Sagittarians have been dealt with. So we're going to go ahead, attack both of this. I see a unit of cavalry over here that's trying to make its move towards me. Fortunately, this cavalry did take a lot of damage. Okay, so however, that's not much to worry about because keep in mind they are population class 2, so you know, it's not really that big a deal. Meanwhile, we're going to keep pushing up our front lines. It's time to completely take on the enemy because the enemy cannot actually deal with us. Meanwhile, this cavalry is looking to make a charge for us, so we are going to try to buy ourselves a little bit more time. Start using our slingers quickly behind. Get behind. Okay, there we go. Perfect. Move our general behind as well. He's done a good job. Gotten rid of some of this cavalry. Of course, this cavalry over here is doing quite a good, decent job of it. Meanwhile, we want to be very careful with these javelins once again. So, you know, all of the javelins are being slowly but surely, you know, depleted from the enemy. So, but we are just simply going to make sure that we keep pushing forward. In fact, we're going to do the same with our champions. Meanwhile, this cavalry is given chase, so we really want to chase back into it. Go ahead, chase. Don't get into position. Meanwhile, over here, we want to see if the general is in any good position, of course. And of course, our front lines have engaged, so that is great. We want to make sure that... Oh my god. So very bad positioning over there. And of course we have managed to get that charge off, which is fantastic. Exactly what we wanted. Gotten rid of another cavalry unit. Quickly going to pull out our cavalry, and now we're going to perform our flanking over here. Hopefully it happens exactly as we planned for in the initial phase of the battle that we discussed. Use our light cavalry to chase down enemy cavalry. There's really no point in sending in our heavy cavalry. Meanwhile, our front line sort of kind of stabilized, and this is where we need to be extremely quick because our front line is going to take quite a lot of damage if we are not quick. Alright, the reason being is Roman legionaries are just too good. So what we are going to do over here, we're going to charge into this general. We're going to charge again with our general. Make sure that we get a very good attack off, and there we have it. Good rear charge. This general didn't actually charge into us, so we are just simply going to keep doing that. Now meanwhile, what we're going to do is we're going to perform our maneuver, and that's basically how we do it. Get these guys over here, get these guys over here, and as you can see, it'll be a very quick maneuver instead of getting these guys all the way around. Meanwhile, we have some cavalry over here that can continue to engage, and we are going to keep attacking. Fortunately, this guy is perfect. This guy we need to realign. This guy is also almost perfect, and this guy we need to realign over here. And for some reason this general is quite tanky, and that's rather unfortunate. He's been attacked by 3 Mariposa cavalry, but he is holding his ground quite well. And now once all of the munitions used, we are going to charge into the enemy completely. We want to make sure we get rid of this cavalry as quickly as possible before that infantry unit kind of engages us. And there we're going. We are doing quite well. Just basically trying to juke this infantry into thinking that we are going to attack it. So we're going to keep preventing it from reinforcing over there. And there we have it. Okay, we have all of it done. Meanwhile, we're going to move our general all the way over there. We're going to move our other cavalry over here. The enemy general looks to be in a very bad situation. Over here, we are going to go ahead, and now it's time to actually use our cavalry, our powerful Remic Maripos cavalry for their charge. And that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to go ahead, charge into the backs of those archers. And once we charge, we are going to go ahead and, start one of our battle rhythm things. And battle rhythm is actually a very, very powerful ability, so we're going to keep doing that. Meanwhile, over here, we're going to charge into this first cohort. Go ahead, keep moving our cavalry, use our light cavalry to kind of attack this unit. And we're going to move our general as well behind. Keep moving our swordsmen, try to get as much as possible. All of it going over there, that's perfect. We're going to use this Reme Maripos, and as you can see, we have completely entirely encircled the enemy. We're going to keep performing that general charge, and we are going to keep attacking these units as much as we can. We're going to ignore this sword unit that's over there in the back. What we are trying to do is we are trying to kind of rout the entirety of the enemy army, of course, and we are going to keep pushing with our swordsmen, make sure that our swordsmen get as much of the damage as possible. And we are of course going to continue the battle because we have a lot of cavalry, so why not? And we are quickly going to assign each of our cavalry to deal with enemy units very quickly. Over here, just go ahead, select some of the enemy units, select another cavalry unit over there. Our general's pretty much doing nothing. He can go ahead in this direction. We have a light cavalry, which is amazing, so he can go ahead and help the general quickly. I'm just tapping this icon in the bottom corner just to make sure that of course I am doing it, and we're going to use our light cavalry to kind of assist over there, quickly tapping to see if I am actually giving chase to as many units as I possibly can. So we're not currently doing that, so we're going to go ahead, do it with our light cavalry. We're going to try to get rid of as many units as we possibly can from the battlefield as quickly as we possibly can. So there we have it. That's what we're doing. Very quickly over here as well. Okay, that's pretty good. Let's go ahead, attack. These guys are moving in the opposite direction. Should give me about enough time to deal with them. And as you can tell from the casualties, we have hardly taken any casualties, and a lot of units have actually performed really, really well. Of course, our front lines have managed to take very minimal casualties. So all in all, a very, very good battle. Of course, one of our cavalry did take a lot of damage, and that's because, of course, we got precursored to in hell. All right, sorry for the swearing, but yeah, that's exactly that's kind of what happened. And unfortunately, at the end of the day, we lost a little bit of cavalry over there, and sorry again for the profanity. However, that being said and done, let's go ahead and end the battle, and I will see you all in the post-battle analysis. Alright guys, so there you have it. As you can see in the post-battle analysis, a very decisive victory, 455 losses. We almost entirely annihilated the Roman army. This unit, the general managed to survive, and of course even this legionary unit and this auxiliary unit managed to survive. So basically 3 units entirely, completely, the remainder of the army is entirely, completely wiped out. This is about 8 times the men that we lost, so we kind of killed 8 Romans for every single Gallic troop that we lost. And of course you have to consider the fact that we lost a lot of our cavalry in that early skirmishing phase. If that skirmishing phase on the left flank was handled a little bit better, this casualty would be a lot less. But however, that being said, as you can see, some of the most important and vital units of the battle, of course our slingers did a great job completely nullifying the use of their archers. Their armored skirmishers, I have no love for them. They are some of the hardest units to deal with in the game for several reasons. One is that they have a big massive shield, so that they are extremely difficult to deal with using missile units. Apart from that, they have really good armor, so they are very difficult to quickly dispatch off in a melee engagement. So the only real option you have is cavalry, but being a javelin skirmisher, these guys are not going to stray too far away from their own melee infantry, so it's going to be very hard to isolate them. As you could tell, it was a lot easier to to isolate the archers than it is to isolate the javelin units, so they did a lot more damage. Meanwhile, if you take a look at the Roman frontline troops, they did pretty decent. If you compare them to our own frontline troops, the stats are pretty much comparable, so they didn't really outshine our pop 2 heavy spearmen, but they would absolutely do so. As you can see, some of our spearmen started to take some casualties, especially this unit over here was doing pretty bad. I mean, 25 kills for this many casualties means it probably was in a bad situation. So yeah, if we allowed the battle to continue for a lot longer, then it could have been a little bit more casualties on our front line. However, what we did perform to absolute perfection is our flanking maneuver. As you can see, that new strategy on the flank where I use the closer unit to go deeper in the flanking maneuver, and I use the further unit to come closer into that flanking maneuver, made me able to perform that flanking maneuver really quickly. And one of the things you might have noticed in the battle, guys, is that I did use one of my general ability, and I find that to be a very, very powerful general ability, and that quickly shattered the left flank of the Roman army. As you could see in the battle, if you guys go back to the battle, you'll see at the exact moment the left flank collapses on the enemy right. I try to get my general into a charge in the general vicinity. I charge him into a missile troop that's in that that blob of enemy units, and I quickly activate a general ability, namely Battle Rhythm. Now, Battle Rhythm is extremely powerful, guys. However, you can only use it once in the battle, and after its usage, your troops will be kind of exhausted for an extended duration, but it's completely worth it to quickly shatter a flank. As you saw in that battle, I was able to quickly shatter the entirety of the Roman left, and that is why if you take a look at all of our spearmen, as you progress from left to right, you will see that the casualties on the left is really low. Meanwhile, the casualties on the right hand side is a lot higher. But what that also means is that, of course, on the right hand flank, some of these flanking troops had a little bit more fighting to do, so they were able to kill a lot more enemy units as opposed to the left hand flank. But all in all of our Gallic champions performed absolutely amazing, each of them racking up to 200 kills, some of the highest kill counts in the entire battle of any unit on either side are our Gallic champions, of course. And if you total this up, you're looking at about 1,300 of 3,200 kills. That's more than 1/3, so that's more than 33 to 40% of the total casualties inflicted on the enemy army was performed by our Gallic champions. So even though they are not as good as some of the veteran champions of the Nervii, and of course you can even replace these guys with the naked Germanic mercenary unit. Those guys have better armor piercing. They will come from that foreign class population, and of course they even have the fear ability, which makes them even better at flanking because you're going to be able to rout out enemies a lot quicker. These guys still perform quite well. So just imagine if you replace these guys, these population class 1 guys, if you would want to. Of course, if you would want to keep that role-playing aspect, you can still retain these guys. In my honest opinion, they're quite good even if you retain them, but of course there are better alternatives out there, so it's totally up to you. But a quick assessment of the population loss. As you can see, our army was completely comprised of population class 2 as well as population class 1. Most of our casualties were inflicted on the population class 2. As you can see, this one cavalry was caught in a very bad position and got blown to smithereens. And of course, we lost about, let's say, about 100 warriors over there. And of course, if you to add this up, you're looking at about another 60, so 160 warriors over there. Meanwhile, among our spearmen, pretty much we lost, you can say, about 20 in each. So 20 times 6 is another 120. So we lost about, let's say, 350 to 400 population class 2. Which is not that bad. Meanwhile, as far as our population class 1 losses are concerned, we barely lost 50 population class 1. So that is actually pretty amazing, just the way we handled the battle. And what this means, and why do I emphasize so much on that population class losses, is that it means in the next turn in a campaign, you're going to be able to replenish a lot faster because it's easier to replace population class 2 than it is to replace population class 1. What that means is that in the next turn, once you're replenished, your army is good to go for another offensive, which means you are able to expand a lot faster. So that being said and done, I hope you guys really enjoyed the battle. So we are going to move on to the next part of this video. Alright guys, welcome to the final part 4 of this video, in which we will be discussing my personal recommended army traditions and general skills build. And we are going to begin with the general skills. For the general skills, we want to get the military logistician. That is incredibly important, because as you can see, the upkeep of this unit, the naked Gallic spearman for example, is 159 per turn, but by maxing it out we actually get a minus 15% upkeep for all land units. And what that means is that the army upkeep is dropped down significantly by about 27 denarii. That might not seem as much, but if you times that with 20 units in the army, you're talking about 500 denarii in the case of Gallic naked spearmen. However, the more expensive your units, like of course this unit over here, 333 upkeep, is now reduced to 276, so that's nearly 60 denarii. So that is a huge decrease to the army upkeep, which allows you to create and maintain a lot more armies. And more importantly, what this also unlocks for you is the military conscriptor. Now the military conscriptor is very nice because it gives you not only a non-mercenary recruitment cost decrease of minus 15%, but more importantly a plus 15% replenishment rate for all units, which means if a unit is at 25% strength, let's say out of 200 men you have just about 50 men after a battle in which this unit took a lot of casualties, it's just going to take you about 1 or 2 turns to completely replenish this unit, so long as you have the population class in order to do so, which means that you are going to be able to maintain your offensive pressure on the enemy. And offensive pressure on the enemy is really important, because every turn you have to wait for your replenishment to continue or to take place. You're giving the enemy AI an opportunity to recruit a new army, and you will potentially have to fight a new battle. So if you are able to replenish a lot faster and keep your armies on that offensive, you can gain the momentum on your side. For those of you who have watched my Let's Play Seleucid series, you see how I kind of try to use that momentum to keep attacking Bactria. We start out the war against Bactria with just 3 armies against 6 armies, but because of my faster momentum, I was able to reduce that down to a 4 versus 4 army situation, and eventually a 4 versus 2, and finally a 4 versus 1, and then we managed to even in fact subjugate Bactria. So from starting at a numerical disadvantage, I was able to keep pushing that momentum forward, and that is because of course of this military conscriptor ability. Next up, you want to focus on the ferocious warrior. That is not so good in terms of benefits to your army. It does give you a +9 morale for all units during offensive battles, which is not that big of a deal. However, what it does unlock is of course your trained swordsmen and your skilled cavalrymen. These are the 2 things that you will absolutely need as the Arverni, because you have a lot of infantry units, your frontline infantry units, your flanking infantry units, and of course you have some of the best cavalry in the whole of the Western European hemisphere. So you really want to boost those cavalry as much as you possibly can, because that will allow your cavalry to pack even more punch. However, that being said and done, the next thing you want to focus on, in my opinion, is of course you want to go for the commander of men. And while that does not once again give you a good benefits, such as it only gives you a +6 morale for all units, which is not all that great, what it does do is it gives you an unlock for the booming voice and the dread commander, which in my opinion are must-haves for the Arverni, and I'll explain why shortly. So as the Arverni, you want that movement speed so that your armies are a bit more maneuverable, especially your cavalry. You have decent speed at the start, a speed of 7, but you can bump that up all the way to speed 8, and in the case of your light cavalry, speed 9, which is going to help you in that phase 1 of your battle, of course. And of course it's going to make your maneuvering a lot faster, especially with your lighter troops. What that means is that you're going to be able to flank the enemy a lot faster. And keep in mind the speed at which you conduct phase 2. Phase 1 can be as long as it takes. Phase 2 should happen absolutely quickly, so that you minimize the casualties to your front lines, because as the Arverni you don't really have amazing frontline units. However, the build that we went for in, of course, the battle, is that we went for the Gallic heavy spearmen as my front line in that defensive formation, and for the flanking units we used Gallic champions, which is a population 1 unit. However, in a campaign, if you're able to recruit some of the Germanic naked axemen over here, those guys are really good mercenary units. You can use them to replace your Gallic champions, which are population class 4, replacing your population class 1, which means you can replace your frontline units from the Gallic heavy spearmen, which is population class 2, with of course the Arverni noble shield wall. And the Arverni noble shield wall is a shield wall formation, 200 men strong, population class 1, and they are definitely a more superior version of a frontline, and they can do really well. Of course, taking losses with those units is again very detrimental because they are population class 1, so you got to keep an eye out for that. But technically speaking, that army composition is going to be more superior than the one we just used in the previous part of the episode. However, that being said and done, once you do get the booming voice ability, you also get Rally and Inspire. And now what Rally and Inspire does is it's a combination of the two default general abilities you get in battle. The first one being Inspire, which increases your melee attack, your missile damage, and also increases the rate of missile fire of all of your units. And the second default ability that you have is Rally, which increases the morale of your units. So Rally is really good to have, especially when you see some of your units are wavering. That's when you want to trigger the Rally ability. However, the Rally and Inspire ability is a combination of these two abilities. So what this basically does is it kind of creates an additional ability that you can use in between the cooldowns of the two default abilities that each of your generals have in Divided Impera. Next up, you will use the Dread Commander because, of course, none of your units have that morale penalty versus the enemy. This Dread Commander gives a minus 15% morale for all enemy units, and it's applied at the start of the battle. It's a very significant debuff, especially for units with higher morale. So if you take, for example, this Levy unit, it has a base morale of 36, and of course, if you take 15% of 36, that is approximately 4 to 5 morale. So its overall base morale will be dropped down to 31, which might not seem like much of a decrease. However, if you take a look at this unit over here, the Gallic Naked Spearman, has a base morale of 61. 15% of 61 is approximately 9 morale. So you're dropping all that base morale down from 61% to about 50. So that is a significant drop, guys, and that is why the Dread Commander is very, very good. Apart from that, it'll also allow you to route out enemies a lot faster, so that your phase 2 happens a lot more quickly than it happened in part 3 of this episode. Apart from that, it also enables the general ability Warcry, which further decreases the morale of a unit in the battle. And this is basically, you click the ability and then you click on a unit in which you want to decrease the morale, and in doing so, you will be able to further decrease the morale. And from my testing, it seems to be capped out at a magnitude of 10 morale. So basically, with the Dread Commander, we managed to drop the base morale of this from 61 to 52 morale, and then another minus 10, and the base morale is actually 42. And 42 base morale means this unit of Naked Spearmen, which typically has some of the highest morale in the entire game, will have the same morale as a Gallic Skirmisher Levy unit at 36 versus 42. So that's pretty powerful combination over there. It will allow you to route out enemy armies really quickly. And now for that final ability, you can choose a multitude of things. You can either choose the Sworn's Bodyguard, which gives you a little bit of an increased weapon damage for your commander's unit. You can go for the Experienced Archer, which gives a little bit more, missile attack for your missile units. Of course, that will really help you out with your phase 1, where you want your missile units to be able to quickly dispatch the enemy support troops. However, you can also replace some of your spear slingers with, as I mentioned, you can replace them with your Balearic Slingers as well. Those guys have much better missile stats. However, you also have some other options that you can go for. You can go for the additional ammunition. In my opinion, this is also pretty good because basically it increases the ammunition of all of your units within your army by 30%, which is quite significant. So you can go for this option. Finally, you can also go for the mercenary connection, since you are going to be hiring a lot of mercenaries. What this does is not so much a buff to the mercenaries in your army. It only buffs their morale, which I consider morale not to be too much of a critical stat in case of a unit. Morale only comes into play if your unit is like surrounded and everything. At that point of time, you really need a lot of morale to stay in that situation. But if you are handling your armies perfectly, then for the most part you shouldn't have any issues with morale. So you'll pretty much be relying on other stats before you have to rely on morale to kick in and save the day for you. Meanwhile, it does decrease the hiring cost of mercenary units, and mercenary units typically quite expensive to hire. As you can see, this mercenary unit is costing me 884. A 15% reduction to that would bump it down to about 600. So it's quite a significant amount, especially in the early game when 600 is 200 denarii less, which is pretty much 10% of your income, which is quite significant. But what I have discovered, in my opinion, and it's one of the general abilities that I used in the battle, is actually the battle rhythm, which you can get with Skill Tactician. Now this is my new favorite, which I haven't actually recommended in the past. And the reason this is my new favorite is that all of your general abilities take 60 seconds, has a effect duration of 60 seconds, so to speak. Now this effect duration is 60 seconds, but it happens in 5 phases. All right. In the first phase, you get a little bit of melee attack, you get a little bit of morale, and you get a little bit of armor piercing boost. And as the phases go on, so as you get your second phase, third phase, and fourth phase, that increases quite significantly. So let's say I were to take an Agrianian Axeman for example. They start out with an overall weapon damage of 35, 15 of which is melee armor piercing, and 20 is base weapon damage. When you trigger the battle rhythm, straight off the bat, that value gets bumped up to 44 overall weapon damage. It gives +2 to the base, +2 to the... And I have seen by the time you reach actually phase 4, something like the Agrianian Axeman that started out with 35 overall weapon damage will end with like 50 weapon damage, which is crazy. It's almost doubling the weapon damage. However, the drawback is once this ability expires after the 60-second duration, the unit will be extremely exhausted. But that doesn't really matter, because as you saw in the battle, pretty much ended up crushing the entire enemy left flank before I could even get past that 60-second duration of the ability. So it's really a good ability to have, and it's especially powerful with units that have armor piercing value. So even though you saw it being so incredibly powerful with my Gallic champions, those guys do not have a lot of armor piercing. In fact, they only have an armor piercing value of 2. But they were still able to completely crush that enemy right flank. However, if you do have armor piercing units such as the Germanic Naked Axeman mercenaries that you can find over here in Germania Minor and Magna Germania and so forth, those guys are going to be absolutely insane, because they do have the same weapon entry as your Agrianian Axeman, which means by phase 4 of battle rhythm, they're going to be dishing out 50 weapon damage. And considering for most of the units in Divided Impera, they have a health of 70 to 80, it means basically 2 hits is a kill. So that's absolutely insane, when it usually takes 5 to 6 hits to land a killing blow against an enemy unit. However, in the case of a flanking maneuver, you are going to be dodging a lot of the shield blocks, you're going to be landing a lot of hits, and it'll just take 1 to 2 hits to land that killing blow with battle rhythm. However, that's the first 4 phases of battle rhythm, which last for about 60 seconds. The 5th phase, as I mentioned, is an extended duration of fatigue. However, this extended duration doesn't last that much long in my tests, and it's very quickly the unit gets back to fresh. So I do consider this to be a very powerful quick shock ability that you can use. Keep in mind, you can only use it once in a battle, unlike some of the other abilities in which you can use them 3 times in the battle. However, this one you can only use once in the battle, so use it extremely wisely. In the case of part 3 or section 3 of this guide, as you saw, I used it at the precise moment I wanted to, and that is when I wanted to crush the Roman right flank with my left flank of Gallic champions. However, that being said and done, that is all the general abilities that I recommend for the Arverni generals, and keeping that in mind, of course, I would recommend this for most of my army builds, especially the military logistician, the military conscriptor, of course the trained swordsman. These are 3 of the abilities that I will always take regardless of what faction faction I'm playing as, except of course if I'm playing as the steppe nomads where I don't have a lot of melee infantry, then I will not go for the trained swordsman. But another one of the things that I would recommend is the skilled tactician, because it does give you that battle rhythm ability that you can use to quickly get rid of an enemy unit or a bunch of enemy units. However, that being said and done, let's hop on to the army traditions that I recommend. So the first thing you want to get is Wolves of the North. This gives an increased melee attack for all of your units, which is amazing. And then you want to get the Formidable Spearman. By getting the Formidable Spearman, you increase the melee capabilities of all your spear-armed units. So if you take a quick look at your Naked Spearmen, they're already 17 and 18 in terms of their melee stats, respectively in their melee attack and melee defense. And finally, you want to get the Indomitable Infantry that further boosts the melee and defense skills for all of your infantry. So as you can see now, the Spearmen are at 19 and 19, they start at 14 and 14. So that is a pretty significant boost. Next up, you want to get the Rapine Plunderers. This gives you a little bit benefit while besieging. That might not seem like much, but more importantly, you want to get the Frontier Conquerors. The subsequent Frontier Conquerors does give you a little bit of campaign range movement, and that might not seem like much, but what it does unlock is absolutely amazing. You have the Legacy of Brennus that gives some morale, but more importantly, gives a flat out increase to weapon damage inflicted by all army units. So as you can see over here, the base weapon damage of the Naked Spearman is 25 plus 6, so an overall of 31. But now if we take a look at it over here after the buffs, it's 26 plus 6, so it's 32. So that's quite significant, especially if you have really high armor piercing units. Once again, this ability is going to be extremely powerful. Next up, for the army traditions, you want the Hard Spear Guard. That gives you a boost to your melee defense skill for all units. So once again, as you can see, our Naked Spearmen are slowly increasing in their melee defense, and now they have comparable melee defense to pure spear units. Keep in mind, these guys are shock spear units, and now they have the defensive capabilities of a pure spear unit just because of the buffs that they get from that army tradition. Next up, we want to get these Stalwart Heart Defenders, and the Stalwart Heart Defenders, they are not really good in terms of the buffs that they give, but they do unlock the subsequent Unfettered Warriors. Now the Unfettered Warriors is quite good because it gives you 9 melee attack and 9 melee defense skill for all infantry units. More importantly, it gives you also +4 movement speed for all units, so all of your units are a lot faster. And as you can see, with this final build, we have 20 melee attack, 21 melee defense. And of course, the final and one of my most favorite things is of course the Chieftain's Chosen. This is the special abilities available for the Galley faction, such as the Arverni and the Nervii. You want to go ahead and select this. What it does give you is another +3 weapon damage inflicted by all army units. So what this does is it bumps up your weapon damage to an overall of 33. So you start out at 31 overall weapon damage in the case of the Gallic Naked Spearman, 25 plus 6, which is now bumped up to 27 plus 6. And if you take a look at your General's Bodyguard, you start out with 27 and 5, and now because of all of these abilities, you now have 35 and 5, which is 40 weapon damage for your general's unit. That is absolutely insane compared to the 31 that you start out with. So definitely as one of the builds that I recommend is definitely this, and of course this is the general's build that I recommend. However, with that, I am going to go ahead and end the video. So I hope you all enjoyed the video, and if you like the video, then like the video, and if you are interested for more content like this, please do subscribe for more. Peace and love.